3 miles above the ground, 18,000 feet in the air, 40 degrees below zero outside. Inside the bomber, fire and tearing metal. One explosion, and a man disappears from the aircraft. He does not jump. He is thrown into the night sky. Without a parachute, 1 second, and there is only wind, black emptiness, and a body falling at more than 100 miles per hour. At that altitude, a man has about 90 seconds before impact. Bones shatter, organs rupture. Survival is not expected. But minutes later, residents of a small European town will hear a heavy crash. They will think it is wreckage. When they walk closer, they will not see twisted metal. They will see a man. And the most terrifying part, he is still breathing. This is the story of a fall that should have meant death, but became one of the most unbelievable survival stories of World War II. Before that fall, before the explosion, before the night swallowed him whole. He was just 19 years old, a farm boy from the American Midwest, raised on early mornings and frozen fields. He grew up fixing fences, milking cows, watching planes carve white lines across the sky. He enlisted the week he turned 18, not because he was fearless, but because everyone said the war would be over soon. By 1944, it wasn't. The air war over Europe had become a furnace. Bomber crews, called deep missions, trips into hell. The average life expectancy of a tail gunner was measured not in years, but in missions. 25 missions meant you went home. Most crews never reached 15. He trained to shoot at moving targets, to calculate speed and distance in seconds, to fire short bursts so the barrels wouldn't glow red. They taught him how to survive combat. They did not teach him how to survive falling from the sky. That night, his bomber lifted off from England, engines roaring, formation lights blinking in the dark. 10 men inside 1 aluminum shell, crossing the channel toward enemy territory. Below them, searchlights waited, anti-aircraft guns waited, fighter pilots waited, and none of them knew that before sunrise, one of those men would be alone in the air, with nothing between him and the ground, not even a parachute. The formation crossed the coastline just before midnight, engines steady, bomb bay doors sealed, guns loaded. From above, the city looked asleep. Dark streets, thin rivers of yellow light, quiet rooftops beneath a layer of clouds. Then the sky exploded. Searchlights snapped on, white beams cutting through the darkness, locking onto aluminum bodies in the sky. Flak followed, black bursts blooming around the formation. Each explosion close enough to shake the ribs inside your chest. The bomber rocked violently, shrapnel hammered against the fuselage like thrown gravel. Someone shouted over the intercom, then static. He scanned the horizon from his gun position and saw them. German fighters climbing through the clouds, closing fast. They came in from below first, a tactic meant to avoid most defensive fire. He squeezed the triggers. Twin machine guns answered with a violent roar, tracer rounds arcing through the night. One fighter broke away, another replaced it. The sky was no longer sky, it was motion, fire, metal. Then it happened, a flash brighter than lightning, a direct hit near the wing root. The aircraft lurched sideways, warning lights flared red. The cabin depressurized in an instant. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was a scream of tearing aluminum. The bomber began to break apart, and in less than a second, the world beneath him disappeared. He was no longer inside the aircraft. He was outside, falling. Inside the shattered tail section, Alan felt the world collapsing around him. The roar of engines was gone, the voices of his crew silent. Only the violent scream of rushing wind filled his ears. He was falling, not in a parachute, not in control. He was still strapped to his gun turret, trapped inside a piece of a dying airplane. The sky spun above him as the tail twisted through the air. Metal groaned. Panels tore away. Snow-covered earth rushed closer with terrifying speed. He tried to move. Pain shot through his legs. Blood soaked into his uniform. His oxygen mask was gone. The air burned his lungs. And then, something impossible happened. The spinning slowed. The torn metal frame, wide and curved like a broken wing, began to catch the freezing air. The tail section shifted, tilting slightly upward. Instead of dropping straight down, it started to glide. Not smoothly, not safely, but just enough. Below him, a dense German forest stretched like a dark sea. Snow blanketed the trees, thick and heavy. Alan closed his eyes for a second. He thought of home, of warm sunlight, of laughter. Then the ground came for him. Branches exploded against twisted metal. Wood snapped like rifle shots. The tail slammed through the treetops, shredding, slowing, breaking apart piece by piece. And finally, silence.
Silence. But not for long. Alan's ears rang in the frozen stillness of the forest. The world around him was white and shattered. Broken metal hung from splintered trees like torn banners of war. He was alive. He didn't understand how, but he was breathing. Pain burned through his body. His legs wouldn't respond. Every breath felt like glass in his lungs. Snow drifted slowly through the ruined tail section. Cold air wrapped around him, sharp and merciless. He tried to reach his sidearm. His hands trembled violently. Somewhere in the distance he heard voices. Not American. Boots crushed through the snow. German soldiers were moving carefully between the trees, weapons raised. They had seen the smoke. They had followed the wreckage. Alan knew he couldn't run. He couldn't even stand. For a brief moment he considered firing his weapon, going down fighting. But his strength was fading, and the cold was closing in. A figure appeared through the trees. A helmet, a rifle, a cautious step forward. The soldier froze when he saw movement inside the wreckage. Their eyes met. The war, reduced to two young men staring at each other in the snow, one barely alive, the other unsure whether to shoot or save him. The German soldier slowly raised his rifle, then hesitated. Alan could see it in his eyes. Not hatred, not rage, just shock. No one was supposed to survive that fall. The soldier shouted something over his shoulder. More boots crunched through the snow. Rifles aimed. Fingers tightened on triggers. Alan let his sidearm slip from his hand. It disappeared into the snow beside him. He was done fighting. Two soldiers moved closer, cautiously pulling him from the wreckage. Pain exploded through his body as they dragged him free. He screamed, the sound tearing through the silent forest. His legs were shattered. Shrapnel had torn through his side. Blood stained the snow dark beneath him. One of the soldiers knelt down. To Alan's surprise, he removed his gloves. With steady hands, he pressed cloth against the wound to stop the bleeding. The war had paused, just for a moment. They lifted him onto a stretcher made from broken branches and canvas. The forest above blurred as they carried him away from the wreckage. Behind them, the twisted tail section lay half buried in snow. Proof of something that should have been impossible. Alan drifted in and out of consciousness. Cold, darkness. But he was still alive. When Alan opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the forest. A dim ceiling hovered above him. The smell of antiseptic replaced the scent of smoke and snow. He was in a German military hospital. For days, he drifted between fever and darkness. Surgeons worked to remove shrapnel from his body. Both of his legs had been severely fractured. One lung had partially collapsed. The doctors were stunned. They had treated crash survivors before, but never someone who had fallen from the sky inside a piece of an airplane. Whispers spread through the ward. The man who fell without a parachute. Alan became a prisoner of war soon after, transferred from hospital to guarded camp. Behind barbed wire and watchtowers, winter dragged on slowly. Hunger, cold, uncertainty. Yet every morning he woke up, he reminded himself of one thing. He should have died in that forest. But he didn't. And as long as he was breathing, the story wasn't over. Months later, the war began to shift. Distant artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. The guards grew nervous. Whispers of advancing Allied forces spread through the camp. Then, one morning, chaos. Orders shouted in panic, engines starting, some guards fleeing. And then, silence. Hours passed, until unfamiliar voices echoed beyond the fence. English. Allied soldiers entered the camp, weapons raised. They expected resistance. Instead, they found prisoners staring back in disbelief. Alan could barely stand when liberation came. He had lost weight. He carried scars that would never fade. But he was alive. Doctors later calculated the fall. Over 18,000 feet. No parachute. Trapped inside the tail section of a destroyed bomber. It should have been impossible. And yet, history remembers him as the man who fell from the sky and survived. When the war finally ended, Alan returned home a different man. Not just because of the scars, not just because of the limp that would stay with him for life, but because he carried something invisible, the memory of the fall. For years, he rarely spoke about it. How do you explain the moment you watched your world tear apart at 18,000 feet? How do you describe the silence after the engines stop? When you realize you were still alive? Doctors called it luck. Engineers later analyzed the wreckage and called it physics. The wide, broken tail section had acted like a crude glider. The snow-covered forest softened the final impact, but none of that explained the feeling. The spinning sky, the rushing earth, the certainty of death, followed by impossible survival. Alan rebuilt his life slowly. He walked again. He worked. He started a family. Yet every winter when snow covered the ground, he remembered that forest. And the day gravity almost won. War is filled with stories of loss, of heroes who never came home. But sometimes, history gives us something else, a reminder. That survival can exist in the middle of destruction. That even when metal tears apart in the sky, hope can remain. Alan's fall was never meant to be possible. No parachute, no control, no chance. And yet, against logic, against gravity, against war itself, he lived. So the next time you look up at the sky and see an airplane crossing the clouds, remember this. Once, a man fell from that same sky, and the world wasn't ready to lose him.